I'm so looking forward to this next guest. This is Kenny Zhu. He is a renowned public commentator on education, minority achievement, and critical race theory. He is the author of An Inconvenient Minority, an attack on Asian American excellence and the fight for American meritocracy. And more recently, he is the author of School of Woke, How Critical Race Theory Infiltrated American Schools and Why We Must Reclaim Them. And he is also a Republican candidate. So we spoke about all the big questions shaping race in America today, whether that is the Supreme Court ruling on affirmative action, the various different presidential candidates, and whether or not they're really paying attention to the bubbling controversies across America around race, education, and schools, and so much more. So hope you enjoy it. So thank you so much, Kenny, for joining me. Really looking forward and excited to have this conversation with you. So the primary people that watch and listen to our podcast are from the UK. So some of them have been, I'm sure, following many of the developments that go on in America when it comes to race, and they undoubtedly influence many of the discussions here in the UK as well. But the first thing, before we dive into some of the things that you've been writing in your recent books, which I think are really fascinating and want to dive deeper, I guess from a UK perspective, one of the things that have really caught our eye has been the affirmative action, the ending of affirmative action and the Supreme Court ruling there. And as I understand, you were involved in some ways in terms of campaigning around that issue to end affirmative action. Could you just tell us a little bit more about what affirmative action is, what your perspective on it has been, and what has happened in the last month in America?
Sure. So I am Kenny Xu. I'm an author, activist. I'm running for Congress in North Carolina. So you might see more of me in U.S. government politics very soon. The affirmative action case is sort of where I cut my teeth, right? What affirmative action is it's an attempt to redress historical injustices of slavery and Jim Crow in America by giving preferences to Black people and to a lesser extent Hispanic people in the United States. Although it really doesn't make sense why Hispanics would get affirmative action, but they do. But it's Black people really, and they will do things like, for example, if you're applying to Harvard and you're Black, but let's say your SAT scores and your grades are not as high as an Asian American applicant. Harvard will pick you over the Asian American applicant because you're Black. And as much as there's been various measurements to describe this sort of affirmative action, but my best, the most accurate measurement is that academically, if you're an Asian American, you have a 25% chance of admission based on academics to get into Harvard. You would have a 75% chance if you were Hispanic, and you would have a 95% chance if you were Black. I think that that's the best measure that we used. It's the most accurate one. That's what happened at the Harvard case.
And so why was it overturned? And because a lot of people, maybe not necessarily people listening to this podcast, but I mean, in terms of the wider discussion, some of the arguments that were bandied around was this was really, unjust. That the systematic legacy of slavery, and Jim Crow and Black codes and so on put African Americans in an unfair position, and therefore this was part of one of the policies arguably implemented in order to redress that balance, as you said. So why was it something that you disagreed with and campaigned against?
Well, because I think Americans are pretty much tired of using race as a justification for preferences. At this point and at this stage of our history, it is long ago that we had slaves, and we've made some redress. For example, welfare policy disproportionately goes to Black Americans. Public education disproportionately goes to Black Americans. Medicaid disproportionately goes to Black Americans. We've made a lot of redressive policy. Now, I think Americans are finally sick and tired of using race as a category now to describe these kinds of things because fundamentally we want to move past that. We don't look at our friends, we don't look at our enemies based on our race. We look at them based on do we live near them? Are we shared interests? Do we like the same things? Do we have the same values? And that extends beyond skin color. And I think we're finally sick and tired of using skin color as a category to judge others.
And how was this received within the Asian American uh, diverse community as they are? I mean, because obviously Asian Americans were the part of the justification as to why it should have been overturned because they were discriminating against another ethnic minority, as you mentioned. But what was the reaction amongst Asian Americans to the ruling?
I think it was largely positive, Um, the majority of Asian Americans don't support racial preferences in education. About 60+% of us said we wouldn't in a recent Pew poll. Um, there are a few Asian Americans that do support discrimination against Asian Americans in the higher education system. And those are Asian Americans who I think are largely liberal and who have been raised in the upper middle classes and have sort of been taught to believe that their achievement is a form of privilege. Well, I have news for you. Hard work and study is not privilege. Okay, if Asian Americans study twice as many hours as the average American, which they do, they should be rewarded for it. So I have been in the process of rounding up the remaining Asian American stragglers who are opposed to me on this issue and convincing them because we're right.
And so, what do you say to those who say that whilst ostensibly affirmative action might have ended, that many of these elite universities will find other ways in order to privilege, one might argue, African American people. And I've read some things that, within their applications, they can talk about how race has been a factor in them having certain barriers and so on. So where do you see where do you see that discussion? Do you think there's more that needs to be done in the particular area of affirmative action, or are you just saying that okay, this is a really important victory and leaving it at that?
They will try, universities will try. Some universities will. I will say the university that is closest to me, the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. I'm not sure if you Brits are familiar with it, but it's a very prominent public Ivy League university in the United States. They have come out and flat out said we will not use race in admissions, not even in application essays. The Board of Trustees passed a resolution for that. They're going to rely on merit-based metrics. So I support them in that. So not all universities are going to try to evade the system, but I do predict a university like Harvard, which is so arrogant in itself and its own self-importance, that it feels the need to discriminate against Asian Americans despite the ruling, that they will try to evade it by either getting rid of SAT scores as a criterion for entry or doing some other affirmative policy. And I just love it when their internal discussions are recorded and exposed because you hear the diversity officers and you hear their admissions officers say things like, "Well, we can't use socioeconomic affirmative action because it results in too many Asians and whites getting admitted." And I'm like, "Oh, why is that a problem with you?" The whole point of the Supreme Court decision is to eliminate race in consideration for admissions, and now you're trying to keep doing it. So the more they will do that, the more they will lose, the more they will look bad, and I will be excited to, see them lose on that.
But before we move on to your recent book, School of Woke, just a few more questions on affirmative action. I mean, what do you say to those that say that actually, well, whilst we got rid of affirmative action, we still need policies to uplift and economically empower minority communities, particularly African American and Hispanic Americans, because the long and short of it is that they are still racially speaking at the bottom of the economic pile, and so if it's not race-based policies in the form of affirmative action, will there be something that will be put in place in order to at least help them to reach their potential?
I think you're absolutely right. I think we need policies to uplift and empower the members of the African American community. And I would challenge you to name a single time when lowering your standards for somebody just to get them in something uplifts and empowers them. It does not. It just reinforces their victimhood. Everybody knows how a child behaves. They will try to use every excuse to play the victim. These are children's terms. The more you treat African American people like children, the less you're going to get far with them. You want them to grow and you want them to become fully grown, fully valued participants in civil society who are looked upon by other adults as meritorious and competent. And that's what we should be doing for our children. That's especially what we should be doing for our African American children. And I think that does not come in the form of affirmative action. Rather, it comes in the opposite.
Oh, I think you make a really important point there. And I wrote an article in the Telegraph when the ruling came out, and I actually think I think it really institutionalizes a very I would go as far as quite dehumanizing, but at the very least infantilizing message about African American people, that they, somehow are incapable of achieving great heights of education and advancement without the help of these kinds of policies. And actually, when you look at it statistically, many of these policies didn't actually help poor black communities. Many of them helped middle and upper middle class children of black immigrants from West Africa and other places. So I think that's a really important point. Okay, so the next thing I guess I wanted to talk about, and I think it obviously touches upon what you've already been talking about. So you've just released a book called School of Woke, and it is essentially exploring the culture war in the American education system.
My book, School of Woke, is fundamentally about the culture of rot that has shaped our American public education system. And now, yes, it is bleeding over to the UK because the very practices that are being taught in America's education schools, graduate schools, and public policy factories have been exported across the world. And critical race theory is the tip of that spear. Critical race theory teaches African American children that they're victims of a racist and oppressive society. That is as I've just talked about with affirmative action, that is the wrong way of teaching African Americans to succeed. In fact, the polls show it. When African Americans are exposed to critical race theory material, their self-confidence drops, their belief in themselves drops, their ability to see themselves as a full part of American society, which they are, drops. And, I'm one of the few intellectuals, so to speak, now congressmen candidates that are actually willing to get involved with the so-called Black Studies curriculum. Because I know the history of this country. It is not perfect. If with America, it is not perfect, but we fought a civil war to free the slaves. We white people banded together with black people to fight for the civil rights of black Americans. Black Americans were killing it in many ways and have continued to kill it in the United States. 60% of black Americans are more financially affluent than their forefathers, than just the previous generation. We've done a lot, and black Americans have also done a lot, but white Americans have also done things too. And so when you have a Black Studies curriculum, like what was being introduced in California, that completely ignores, for example, Lincoln's signing of the Emancipation Proclamation, which it doesn't even talk about it, or the 1619 Project being introduced in curricula, you are teaching a disempowering and false narrative to black students. It needs to be tackled, it needs to be fought, and that's why I wrote this book, School of Woke.
And I mean, obviously, this has had real electoral force. I mean, we've seen different elections where the fight over the school boards and the school curriculums has really been politically divisive. I mean, what do you make of that, and the fact that many parents have really got involved in this campaign, and that it's actually caused real political division within American society?
I think that there's a justification for why parents are angry. When you have school boards and school administrators that hide their transgender policies from their parents, when a kid informs their teacher that they want to be a girl even though they're a boy, the parent at least deserves to know it. And what you've been seeing in these schools is that the teachers aren't telling the parents. They're trying to refer the kid instead to quote unquote mental health, quote unquote counselors that work with health institutions to trans the child. It is happening. It is real. I cover it in my book, School of Woke. When you have school boards that are teaching kids as young as 6 years old that if you're dark skinned, you're in an oppressed category and you face less privileges just because you're dark skinned. I mean, look at Americans. Like, we all want to be dark skinned. Are you kidding me? We're all going to the tanning bed. We want to be dark skinned. How are you saying it's an oppression category right now? So, you know, and that is happening. That is happening in New York City schools. That is happening with the DEI trainings. People deserve to know. And when they're kept out of the dark, they will become angry. And that is what you see at the school boards.
Mm. I mean, is there a danger, just in terms of the debate, that maybe different minorities get pitted against each other? You know, you have certain anti-racist activists claiming to speak on behalf of the so-called black community, and then they're set framing themselves as doing something that will benefit the black community, but there's other groups that are saying actually this is harming Asian Americans. And because I know that your organization Colorists United is really trying to move beyond that. Could you just tell us more about that, and what you think can be done in order to move America away from this racial prism?
That is true. I serve as president of Colorists United. We exist to advocate for a race-blind society. And I will always support the plight of Black Americans who want to better themselves. What I don't support is when policies are introduced that will privilege Black Americans over Asian Americans. I feel compelled to stand up for Asian Americans when those policies happen. So, for example, Harvard's racial preference systems privileges Black Americans over Asian Americans. That shouldn't happen. Admission should be based on merit. I don't want to privilege Asian Americans over Black Americans, but this should be very simple to understand. We want to take race out of the equation in law, policy, and preferential treatment.
And so you just said prior that you're standing for election. I mean, so what kind of practical policy proposals would you like to see happen, that will shift the conversation and shift people's material reality for the better?
Yeah, well, first thing, I want to zero out DEI in the federal government. The federal government created this problem by really when President Obama came and said all companies have to do something about diversity and inclusion. So, of course, companies came out and did something about diversity and inclusion, which turned out to be very race-based and very harmful to their employees. They started promoting less meritorious employees just because they fit a certain quota. And those incentives, those structures come from federal government affirmative action racial quota policy. So the first thing I'm going to do when I'm in office is any budget that includes diversity, equity, and inclusion, or anything that looks like it, it's out. Sorry, DEI is going to be defunded when I get into Congress. And then the second thing is no more double standards in the justice system. When Merrick Garland, our Attorney General, the United States Attorney General, unleashes the FBI against parent protesters or people who are pro-life protesters, but doesn't do the same towards pro-choice protesters, or doesn't do the same towards, harassers of other people, then he is unleashing an FBI double standard. Really, the FBI shouldn't be getting involved with these local issues. Those should be local police issues. But a misuse of justice for double standards is something that I'm going to stand against as well.
Mm. And so, are you supporting any particular candidate for president?
No, not right now.
No, fair enough.
We're gonna wait until we're gonna wait until to see who endorses my vision, who has the guts to do that, and then I will make my decision from there.
Fair enough, because I think in watching the debates and watching some of the conversation, it does seem that this is very much part of the mainstream conversation. This very much is part of what the candidates feel that they need to bring to the fore in order to connect with the people in America. And do you feel like that conversation is being had, and do you feel like that it's going in the right direction?
I actually do. America, it always, because of the news cycle, you think everything in America is going to crap. But the truth, right now, what we are seeing is a rather coarse but real reckoning of the bad policies in the American system that needs to be wiped away, that needs to be excised from our system. And it's being done in a cathartic and emotional way. But sometimes, but ultimately I think this will heal our country. The abandonment of DEI, of CRT in our system, of lowering standards for minorities. We are moving towards a more race-blind vision in our country, and I want to lead that.
Well, thank you so much for joining me, Kenny Zhu, and really we'll be following your electoral campaign, and very interesting. And I always think it's great when people put their money where their mouth is and actually stand on a platform that they believe in, and try to win the votes of people and citizens in the country. So thank you so much for joining me.
Well, thank you, and I encourage all the listeners to come out and find me at Kenny M. Shu, Kenny M. XU on Twitter, Facebook, and follow me also and donate on my website at kennyshuforcongress.com, kennyxuforcongress.com.